In your view, how likely is it that this agreement actually goes through?
I think it's very likely that the agreement will go through. What I'm more uncertain about is whether it will solve what the US government wants it to solve, namely equal treatment for Chinese companies and US companies and other global companies, and whether or not it will actually stem the tide of worsening US China relations, which seem increasingly likely to lead to all out conflict or war.
And do you think such big hurdles such as that could ever be solved? Is there any agreement that could go through that would satisfy all of those requirements?
No.
No. Okay. Well, let's talk about the ramifications here. If this doesn't, of course, this agreement, like you're saying, doesn't go far enough in your view, but if it doesn't go through at all, what are the ramifications of that? What is actually at stake here?
It seems what the Chinese side is doing is buying time. There still are roughly 18 months or so until the companies would have to delist. I think probably the idea is we'll sign this, the US side will try to implement it. They'll find a lot of stonewalling on the Chinese side. And by 2024, things will be different enough that we'll be able to keep moving the goalposts and keep pushing the can down the road and figure something out then. It doesn't feel like this is a very big concession. It feels like this is a very good stalling technique so that companies on both sides and investors on both sides don't see Beijing communicating that they're not really open for business.
So if that's the future we're looking forward to, that the goalposts just continue to move forward, just a series of stalling techniques, do you think that we'll ever actually see these delistings go through?
It's a great question. I think the question of whether or not these companies will delist will depend so much more on the macro environment at the time. So we
Mm.
saw significant delistings earlier in the month from several large SOEs, presumably because they didn't want any US linked auditors anywhere near their books. I think it's possible that if US China relations worsen, certain companies will delist, maybe not even because of this, but because of other considerations. And I think certainly a lot of promising Chinese companies are finding it less appealing to list on US markets and are looking closer to home for their capital raises.
So why is that? Why is listing on U.S. exchanges maybe not the holy grail or the big goal that it might have once been?
A lot of it is Beijing and the Chinese Communist Party's increasing paranoia about data and data security. And a lot of folks believe this has to do with Beijing really fearing that the US is going to go to war with China against Taiwan if Beijing were to seize the island. And national security is really coming into the forefront. There's an expression in China that in China politics dominates. And I think we're seeing that not only with domestic politics, but really with foreign policy and national security as a major, major force driving Beijing's decisions.
Isaac, who has more to lose here if we make it sort of a binary conversation? I mean, is it more important for a Chinese company to list on a U.S. exchange, or is it more important for that U.S. exchange to have those Chinese companies?
That's a great question. I think it's pretty even. I think from a broader perspective, it's investors who lose because of less choice, less efficient markets. And really, what we're seeing on both sides is the US and China prioritizing national security. And that's what governments do. And that's what investors often don't like governments to do. But that's really the new reality, the new base case for US China relations. So investors thinking about various equities should really have a national security strategy in mind as they make decisions.
And Isaac, going with your expectation that really we just continue to stall and stall, what do you think could happen along the way in terms of the Chinese tech crackdown, for example? Do we expect to see delistings, even if not forced to, for example?
I think that's really possible. And I think one thing investors have to keep an eye out is both Beijing and the US is worried about US companies in China and Chinese companies in America. So if, for example, this seems to move forward and then there's some corruption allegations against a Chinese company on the US exchange, Beijing could retaliate against an American company in China. It's also possible that investors start to feel like the markets in the other country are a lot less appealing and the governments respond accordingly. I do feel like there's a lot of people with large positions in China who want you to believe that this is business as normal, and it's really not. And Beijing has been very explicit about that. So, this to me is not the key signal. This is part of the noise.